So I have the honor to introduce George Didi-Huberman, who is a philosopher, art historian, and professor at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Science in Paris, best known as EHESS, since 1999. Please welcome Didi-Huberman.
I want to thank you very much for their hospitality, David, and Claudia, of course. And I want to apologize for the images which are distorted. And so far, this poor atlas is even smaller due to the change of the format. This is a mythological atlas. This is a lumpen proletarian atlas. And this is a discharged atlas by Goya. I will give you two short fragments of a work in progress. It is about uprisings. The person who tells you that the depth of the air are red is no doubt suggesting that a storm, so to speak, red storm, is going to rise and is going to raise up everything and carry it away. This is a climatic way, a very old one, by the way, to speak of movements that affect the history of human societies. For example, there are magnificent pages in Les Misérables on this theme, where Victor Hugo compares the Paris insurrection to a gigantic ocean turmoil. There are also some wonderful drawings by Victor Hugo. We could even go back as far as Lucretius, whom Hugo was a very, very close reader, and his description of social turbulence at the time of the plague in Athens. In the wonderful prologue to his film Le fond de l'air est rouge, Chris Marker made recent images linked to the political struggles of the 1960s and 1970s, made these recent images rise up, as he did too with the famous re-edited shots from Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin, which tell of the uprising at Odessa in 1905, starting with the collective mourning around the body of Vakulinchuk, the murdered sailor whose death calls for justice. Calls for justice is the title of a part of the Potemkin, the battleship Potemkin, in a very, very Hugolian style. The death calls for justice. With Simone Signoret's inimitable voice and Luciano Berio's Musica notturna nelle strade di Madrid, we see a clash between the crowd going down to view the corpse in battleship Potemkin and the burial of the dead of Sharon metro station in 1962. I quote the script: burial of the dead of Sharon, a woman wipes her eyes, Potemkin, close-up of a woman wiping her eyes, finishing the gesture of the women of Sharon. What does this extraordinary hypothesis, aesthetic hypothesis, and no doubt political, even anthropological hypothesis, tell us? A hypothesis according to which a gesture filmed in 1925 could, I quote, finish the gesture of the woman of Sharon in 1962. It tells us, firstly, that uprisings, in Chris Marker's view, assume a very profound solidarity that links the subjects with their mourning and their desires. This is about Pathosformel, but which also joins the times themselves with their interposed images, and this deals with Nachleben. It is for this reason that we have seen a crowd of fists raised in Battleship Potemkin, like those that were raised on March 4th, 1972, around the coffin of Pierre Auverney, which was followed through the streets of Paris by around 200,000 people. Or like those fists raised in Chicago in the same years by the Black Panthers. And this is how Montage, in Le Fond de l'air est rouge, takes the shape of an atlas of conflict, a builder atlas of conflicts, where, starting with Odessa, the premise of October Revolution, the struggles seem to scatter to every point of the globe and to every moment of history, as though to give the multiple images of a whole world rising up. To go quickly, I cut a quotation and I show you the small beginning, the sequence.
Je ne suis pas parmi ces gens qui ont vu Potemkin quand c'est sorti. J'étais trop petite. Je me souviens... C'est le plan de la viande, certainement, avec les verres. Et puis la petite tente dans laquelle est couché le mort et devant laquelle s'arrête la première personne. Et quand les autres marins mettaient en joue sur le pont du cuirassé, puis au moment où l'officier commandait le feu, un grand marin moustachu qui criait un mot qui s'étalait en lettres énormes sur toute la largeur de l'écran, frère.
I am not surprised that one of the first images of Potemkin, summoned by Chris Marker, was that of a large white sheet. It is the sheet that an officer ordered to be thrown over the sailors before shooting them, a great shroud whose cruel fiction, because it was not in the story, was created by Eisenstein. But of course, it deals with bewegtes Beiwerk. It is exactly what the sailors would soon throw over their heads. In a desperate gesture for freedom, which would appear to be the very first gesture of liberation or emancipation in the film itself. It would be followed, if we speak on bewegtes Beiwerk, it will be followed by the headscarves torn off by the old women in mourning, the shirt torn by the young rebel, when the mourning has yielded to a collective anger, to the fraternal, so to speak, sails of vessels that have come to aid the mutineers, awaiting the hoisting of the red flag atop the mast. And even in the case of the film's premiere in December 1925, the idea planned by Eisenstein of the tearing of the cinema screen itself at the end of the film. So, between the shroud and the sheet and the flag and the tearing, it is as though the storm of the rebellions, as in this beautiful work by Léon Cognel about 1830s insurrections, found its clearest emblem in the rising up of all the surfaces. Eisenstein himself established a direct relation between the idea of political uprising and physical rising up of surfaces, giving as an example, as the iconographic premises of his own Potemkin, giving as an example the revolutionary flag associated with the dress in movement that reveals the breast of Eugène Delacroix's La liberté guidant le peuple, a figurative strategy itself imagined as an afterlife and, of course, a kind of repolarization from the despair expressed by Géricault in the Radeau de la Méduse. With its derisory and tragic sail. Before even claiming to be acts or to be actions, Uprising surged forth from the human history and also the human psyche as gestures, bodily forms. They are forces that make up, rise up, no doubt, but it is indeed forms that, anthropologically speaking, make them perceptible, convey them, direct them, implement them, or make them plastic or resistant, depending on the circumstances. There is today, I think, to be very short and to sum up, a very intense debate in the field of politics against any, I quote, anti-expressive or anti-pathetic vision of politics which we find, for example, in Alain Badiou. Giorgio Agamben sought to give to the human gesture an intrinsic and even, as he says, integral political dimension. I quote the last phrase of his notes on gesture. Politics is the sphere of pure means, that is, of the absolute and complete gesturality of human beings. I consider this phrase a very Warburgian and a magnificent conclusion to a text whose premise is nonetheless, to my view, non-Warburgian and debatable, according to which, I quote the beginning of this text, by the end of the 19th century, the Western bourgeoisie has definitively lost his gestures. End of quotation. Yet, of course, gestures are things that we make every day, all day long, and without even realizing it. We no more lose our gestures, whether we are bourgeois, proletarian, or anything else for that matter. We no more lose our gestures than we lose our experience, as Agamben wrote, apocalyptically and wrongly, I think, in Infancy and History. We don't lose our unconscious desires. If we do not master our gestures to the end, it's the sign that we have not lost them or that they have not let go of us. Gestures are transmitted. Gestures survive in spite of us and in spite of everything. They are our own living fossils, like a duende, this fundamental notion evoked by Federico García Lorca, that rises inside us. The Spanish, who fought against the French occupation in 1808, raised their arms, notably in the images of Goya's disasters, just as in 1924, the workers raised their arms in Eisenstein's strike, or later, 1 year later, in Potemkin. And just as the Black Panthers raised their arms in Chicago in 1969, or in 20 years later, as the Romanians raised their arms when they came to realize their victory over Nicolae Ceausescu's dictatorship, as we can see in Arun Farocki's videograms of a revolution. The examples are infinite. Every minute that passes, I imagine, there are somewhere 1,000 arms raised in the streets, in a factory on strike, or in a schoolyard. I say schoolyard because, of course, of this major moment in Uprising, which is Zéro de Conduite by Jean Vigo. In our dreams, our arms are raised when our emotions are peopled, so to speak, and become riotous. It happens even that people in utter despair fall from high up with their arms raised in a final protest against the order of the world, as in I consider one of the most beautiful paintings by Andy Warhol. Aby Warburg forged the notion of Pathosformel, you know very well, everybody knows, to account for this afterlife of gestures throughout the duration of human cultures. Gestures are inscribed in history. They make up the traces or the light fossilian, as Warburg liked to say, combining the permanence of the fossil with the musicality and the rhythmicity of the leitmotif. Gestures are related to a dynamic anthropology of corporeal forms, and as such, the Pathosformel would be both a visual and temporal way to examine the unconscious at work in the infinite dance of our expressive movements. What Warburg sought was to create a history and a cartography of the cultural fields and vehicles through which our most fundamental gestures take shape. One of the most important polarities of those cultural formants, so to speak, is found, no doubt, in the psychical and corporeal dialectics of what I call in French accablement, soulèvement, which could be translated contrition, uprising. At first glance, Aby Warburg appears to have been very concerned with contrition, but very little with uprisings. In his Atlas of Images, a central place is given to the motif of the lament, plate 42. The introductory plates give us the idea of humanity that is unable to escape the frames by which traditional knowledge determined the very notion of cosmos, plate B. The Titan Atlas is shown only in his suffering and punishment, having to bear the sky on his shoulders, plate 2. In plate 5, we see women fleeing a fate that we know is ineluctable, and in plate 6, the poor Laocoon cannot escape the serpents. Plate 41 shows the Vernichtungspathos, the pathos of annihilation, where we see Orpheus being slaughtered by the furious Maenads. The dead and the injured in Delacroix' Massacre de Schio are slumped in a corner of plate 77, and if any, like a popular fervor, I don't even mention Uprising, appears in Mnemosyne, it seems to be included only in the carnivalesque outlets, plate 32, the Resurrected of Michelangelo or the Deified Victors, plate 54-56, even the Roman crowds gathered in 1929 to celebrate the Concordat between Pope Pius XI, the 11th, and the dictator Mussolini, 78, 79. It seems, therefore, that Aby Warburg neglected the Pathosformel of the politic uprising, and this is no doubt because he was himself very afraid of it, unable as he was to distinguish between the monstra, the formidable depth of the drive, and the astra, the beneficent leaps of reason. This is why we find with difficulty in Warburg's collections of fundamental gestures images of social and political struggles that happened in this time, for example, the 1917 revolution in Russia, or in 1919, the Spartakist uprising in Berlin. Yet, we know how lucid Warburg was when considering the history of culture as a tragedy. He said this, like Zimmel and others, or like an immense field of conflict. The question is the conflict, images, conflict. This is revealed in his work on the imagery of political propaganda at the time of the Reformation, and they coincide with his passionate interest in the iconography of the First World War, which, as we know, led him to the monstra of a psychosis into which he fell repeatedly between endless phases of being totally overwhelmed contrition and very violent episodes of what we could call uprisings. The letter to Binswanger, Protest. Like in Nietzsche and Freud, there is in Aby Warburg's work an extraordinary capacity, even a theory, for inversion of values, applied to the cultural sphere in general. His public work had begun with the beautiful rising up of the mythological graces of Botticelli, or the famous Ninfa Fiorentina in Ghirlandaio, for example. Nothing more innocent, it seems, yet, as with the famous dress of Marilyn Monroe in a Billy Wilder film, it already had to do with what Warburg called erotic pursuits, and therefore with the dialectics of desire from which violence was never absent. As in the case of Botticelli's Spring, this is a rape, or Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. This is a tentative of rape. Furthermore, Warburg's Nympha carries with her, I think, over and above her fundamental grace comparable to that of Freud's Gradiva, a critical function capable of inverting some values attributed to images and to gestures in the traditional practices of historians or art historians. The light step of the servant girl with her moving imaginary breeze, and in the text of Warburg it is in French, brise imaginaire, in the fresco by Ghirlandaio, brings with it then something like a great critical wind or a kind of methodological storm destined to change our usual historical and philosophical approach to images and gestures. Warburg had immediately understood that gestures have a remarkable capacity of inversion. I say again things which were already said here. Physical inversions while maintaining their general meaning, as with those caresses that become violence in the very heart of an erotic gestus, for example, or inversions of meaning while maintaining their general form. This is notably the case studied in Warburg in 1927 when he showed the survival of the gesture of the Niobids in that of Andrea del Castagno's David. An afterlife doubled with an inversion of meaning, since in one case the gesture indicates the state of the vanquished, the approaching death, while in the other case it indicates that of the victor and approaching triumph. Plate 42 of Mnemosyne, for its part, dealt not only with the iconography of the lament, but rather it bore even in its title as well as in its montage, the more profound and dialectical idea of, I quote, energetic inversion of the pathos of pain. Leidens Pathos in energetischer Inversion. That which Eisenstein had masterfully staged in Battleship Potemkin, through an energetic inversion of the contrition or overwhelming burden in front of the body of the dead, into an uprising of an entire people. It is remarkable then that the so to speak, testamentary plate of the Mnemosyne Atlas, on which Warburg was still working when he died in October 1929, should have been presented as both an archaeological and prophetic questioning of absolute powers in politics. On the one hand, the throne of St. Peter, theocratic emblem. On the other, the triumph of Mussolini, fascist hero. Between the two, allusion to the entire history of Western anti-Semitism. It should not be surprising that, far from the pseudo-innocence of Botticelli's nymphs, Warburg's methodology found perhaps its most fertile use in what German disciples of the author of Mnemosyne ended up calling political iconology, as we can see in the creation, and this is a way to pay homage once again to Martin Warnke, up to Uwe Fleckner today, of a library dedicated precisely to these problems inside the walls of Warburg's house in Hamburg. Around these pioneering works of Martin Warnke on iconoclasm and the role of images in political conflicts, we have seen Klaus Herding go through the history of revolutionary propagandas, Wolfgang Kemp in the iconology of the multitude, Horst Bredekamp interpreting visual strategies at the time of Jan Hus or Thomas Hobbes, etc., etc. Dietrich Herben, Christopher Frank, Godhard Janzig, up to Michael Diers, developing this type of analysis for the whole contemporary period. All in all, different ways to recognize in figures, in the visual history of peoples and their gestures, a capacity to make tangible, so to speak, the very dynamics of real uprising. This is Londonderry. Or imagined uprising. This is Pipilotti Rist. Thank you.